Amendment that permits slave labor for incarcerated people. Now, the 13th Amendment, if you recall from high school history, was written to abolish slavery. But one clause exempted slavery for people duly convicted of a crime. And this clause, called the Punishment Clause, allowed Southern states to make money off the free labor of people incarcerated by racist Jim Crow laws. Now, today, with 2.3 million people incarcerated across the country, prison labor has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. In California, incarcerated people were paid about $1 an hour to fight wildfires in 2018. There are, in fact, 43 firefighting prison labor camps in California right now, with 4 of those camps fighting the deadly Creek Fire, covering 143,000 acres. Generally, people who are incarcerated are paid almost nothing. The average prisoner wage has actually declined from the whopping 93 cents an hour in 2001 to less than 86 cents an hour in 2017. And almost all prisoners in 5 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, and Texas, are paid nothing at all for their labor. Slavery is still legal in the United States for millions of people. Now, today we're joined by some guests who are eager to talk about how to change that. Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley, who is introducing a constitutional amendment to close the Punishment Clause loophole, and by Professor Michelle Goodwin of the University of California, Irvine, author of a new piece out today in The Appeal, calling to end this form of modern-day slavery. Thank you so much for being with us. Senator Merkley, I'd love to start with you. So constitutional amendments, when I hear that, I think that's a really big deal, and we really don't see that very often. What would your proposal do?
Absolutely. Well, this clause that you've been referring to that says you can still be enslaved if you've been imprisoned, this is what led to so much terrible consequences. Most of us grew up and heard, well, the Civil War was followed by the end of slavery. Great. It was about time, way past time to abolish that horrific institution. And then we find out later on, and I must say it was really when I was watching the documentary, The 13th, a few years ago, that I was astounded to learn about really what went on in the South after the Civil War, in which really there was an effort to re-enslave Black Americans by imprisoning them and then running them out to plantations. And this led to both horrific consequences for those individuals, the restoration of an economy based on slave labor, mass incarceration, laws that said if you were around after sundown, you could be swept off the street. There was fake imprisonment, all sorts of bad consequences that have reverberated right through to the current day. So you asked about technically what happens with an amendment, and it is very hard to do. It's why we've only done it 27 times in our history. It takes 2/3 of the House voting for an amendment, 2/3 of the Senate voting for an amendment, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify it. That's a very difficult bar to cross.
So you've now launched a petition to gather signatures for ordinary people to call on their Congress members and state legislators to adopt this amendment. And as you mentioned, it would take the legislatures of 38 states, or 2/3 of both the House and Senate, who, as we know right now, rarely agree on much, to adopt this amendment. Now, what's your game plan, if you can reveal it? How are you going to make this happen?
You know, it was about half a year ago that I was pondering the conversation about systemic racism in America, and thought, here's a huge piece of systemic racism that no one's really talking about. It's not being discussed here in the Senate or the House that we should eliminate this. And I was actually quite surprised, because so often when you go, well, we should do something, and then you have your team check into it, you find out 10 other people have already said yes, and here's a plan, but no one had. So I stepped into that breach to start this conversation in the Senate. I know experts outside have been looking at, like you all have been looking at it for quite some time, and thank you very much for that. So here's the plan. One, we need bipartisan support. To be able to help drive that, it would be very helpful to have the Democrats in the majority in the Senate. That may well happen this coming January. This is not the type of thing that Mitch McConnell tends to like to allow to go forward because it divides his caucus. And he was very reluctant to go on anything involving kind of criminal justice reform. I think we will find Republicans across the aisle who, with the history and the consequences of this clause, will join in the effort. We are going to have that bipartisan foundation to get that 2/3 in the Senate and 2/3 in the House. But I don't think it's an impossible reach. I think there's a lot of dialogue that will have to happen over the real meaning of consequences if we do this. Then we have to realize that things happen when there's an outside force and an inside force. So I'll be working to organize people inside, but it's going to be outside groups that are calling in and weighing in and raising this and saying, dear Senator or dear House member, are you aware of this history? And are you aware of the consequences that have reverberated on to the current day? And isn't it time we change this? That's when the magic will occur.
Thank you for that play-by-play. Professor Goodwin, I want to turn to you on this because the senator mentioned some things about the sort of inception of this amendment that were really notable. And I'd love for you to unpack for our viewers why the 13th Amendment had this loophole and what was happening at the time that was created.
It's an excellent question, and thank you for doing this show. So it's really important to understand how wedded and dependent, reliant our nation was on enslavement of Black people. The capitalism behind the enslavement of Black people exceeded all of the wealth that was generated by railroads, let's say, by coal mines, let's say, this sort of industries that we think of as being coexisting during slavery. Slavery was worth far much more than that. And while industrialization was taking place in the North, what the South had was slavery. That was their economy. And so with the threat of that coming to an end, there were lawmakers from the South who did not want it to end. So that when the 13th Amendment, after the conclusion of the Civil War, was being debated, there were Southerners who were not willing to compromise unless there was this punishment clause. And to be clear, there were Northerners who were thinking about even more robust notions of freedom, a human rights platform baked into the Constitution. We never got there because there were senators from former slave states like Delaware, Senator Salisbury, who said we must include a punishment clause. Now, I'm not exactly sure that those in the North understood what could be the lasting effect of that when they allowed that negotiation to go forward. But I can tell you this, and it's really important what we've just heard about the process of ratification. It takes time. The Southerners knew that. So what they were able to do was to broker this agreement and then go to the South and spend the next months creating as many criminal laws as they could possibly imagine and think of to virtually make breathing as a Black person living in the South a crime in which you could be convicted of. And let's be clear, what was associated with this so that it could be perceived as clean hands was that if you could pay your fine, then that could get you out of this criminal situation. But let's be clear, the fines erected in these southern states in 1865 were $50, $75, $100, $150. Now imagine for working class American families today to have to pay a $150 ticket. Imagine a 10-year-old Black kid who now, because he was standing on a corner, has a $50 ticket. And if he can't pay that ticket or his family can't pay that ticket, he's now placed in bondage and can be leased out for the next 10, 15, 20, or 30 years of his life in states like Alabama, Mississippi, and others. So that's a taste of it, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
No, that's fascinating. Actually, I'm going to make you talk more about it. That was my next move, is to make you talk more about this. Because the piece that you published today talks about what you mentioned, the abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner trying to stop the punishment clause, but fellow senators rejecting his proposal. And there's a gender element here that I really want to dig into. There was a fear that his proposal could eventually lead to the horrifying concept of women voting. How is the
right.
historical fight for gender equality tied to ending forced labor?
Well, there are many different iterations and justifications that were made as to why slavery shouldn't be fully abolished. There's sort of sympathies of women also relating to this, that, you know, they wouldn't want to put platforms forward where suddenly women could perceive themselves as free. So let's just explore really quickly one little angle, which is that when the United States was established, and even though it had in its constitution and other policy platforms that there would be equality, it was very clear that equality was just really meant for wealthy white men. Slavery, though, was a very interesting exception because that's where white women also could obtain some level of freedom. But there were limits to that freedom, and there was coverture and so much more. But I think a really important part of understanding the gender connection here, the sex connection as well, is to understand that slavery in and of itself was an enterprise that demanded the physical and sexual labor of Black women, and continually did so even until their death. It extracted every ounce that it possibly could out of Black women. And I think that's really important to note, because even when we think about enterprises of mass incarceration, they tend to have a male look to them. But I think it's important that as we explore this punishment clause and what happened after 1865, that it wasn't only Black men and boys that were sent into dangerous coal mines that would regularly collapse, and where you would have dozens, if not hundreds, in one whole swoop of Black kids just die, even under 10 years old, right? So it was Black women too who were forced into these horrible situations. And let me just say this. After the ratification of the 13th Amendment, there were Southern plantations that actually grew in size. There were letters that were being sent to the Freedmen's Bureau by Black parents begging in what language they could, because they had been denied the opportunity to learn to read and write, but begging that the United States government get involved in their cases because their kids had been kidnapped from them and they couldn't afford to pay these fines and fees. And then there were Black women who were also put on chain gangs. Now, talk about an element of US history that has been virtually ignored. The image of chain gang, usually a Black guy. But what's interesting is that Black women were forced to put on the uniforms that were designed for men, and then to enter these chain gangs and do this arduous, hard labor the same way that men were. And so I think it's really important that as we talk about the impacts of the 13th Amendment post 1865, that we understand it wasn't just men, it was women, and it was also children who were deeply affected by this. And there was considerable sadism that also attended this too. As you look at accounts from the late 1800s, you see that Black women were not only put to physical labor as they had been before during slavery, but you also see just wretched sexual abuse and violence also inflicted upon them. And yet we've yet in American history to really deal with this.
It's very resonant with the circumstances that we hear about today. So
Absolutely.
when I want to kind of bring this home for our viewers, because sometimes when you talk about, oh, your soccer jersey was made by slave labor in another country far away, like people are very quick to glom onto which companies are using really harmful labor practices. But domestically, we don't think about it very much, right? Like I don't really think about if my purchase was made in a US prison. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So how pervasive are consumer products made by forced labor in the economy? And this is a question for both of you. Senator Merkley, if you want to weigh in on the market for these products, I'd welcome you, or Professor Goodwin, if you want to jump in.
Well, I'll just note that in general, a whole lot of products are made, including things in the defense industry that you wouldn't have envisioned. Certainly people in my home state are aware of products that are being made in the prison factories, blue jeans and furniture and so forth. But they're not aware of the whole kind of history and consequences that are associated with this labor. It's a conversation that's really going to have to take place. And they haven't really thought about the situation where essentially this involuntary labor inside prisons displaces jobs for people outside the prison, or how the low cost affects essentially is a profit line for-profit prisons where all kinds of abuses can develop. So there's a lot of pieces to be explored, but I'll turn this over back to Michelle for the details.
So let's also connect one other dot that I should have, which is how this then influenced Jim Crow in the United States as well, so that these are not narratives that suddenly end with Reconstruction, or that suddenly end at the beginning of the 20th century, but that we see a fluidity of these kinds of heinous surveillance, arresting, incarceration, targeting specifically Black people, myriad laws. And I think it's really important to lift up the name of Dr. Pauli Murray here, who was a lawyer who laid the foundation for an equality framework, both in terms of civil rights and women's equality, because she wrote a book about Southern race laws. And it was just to identify them. And it's single space, almost 800 pages worth of these kinds of laws that tracked Black people all through, not just the end of the 19th century, but through the 20th century as well. So when we think about now what this prison labor means, I mean, it's real. And the companies that have been involved in this have been Whole Foods, McDonald's, Walmart, Victoria's Secret, although they're no longer purchasing enslaved labor, AT&T. There have been banks such as Bank of America, pharmaceutical companies such as the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, Cargill, Caterpillar, Chevron, Chrysler, Costco, John Deere, Eli Lilly, and the list goes on. We would be in this briefing far much longer.
That's an amazing list. I'm also just really impressed that you did that off the top of your head. So let me ask you this. Listening to this litany of companies, I'm hearing a lot of different types of labor, right? We're hearing about firefighting, we're hearing about manufacturing, we're hearing about call center work. I'm told that in Colorado, there's even raising certain types of fish and making goat cheese. There's a lot of different jobs. And full disclosure, I am a former public defender, and I've spoken with folks who've spent a lot of time on the inside who found, who have described boredom as being one of the worst things about being locked up. So certainly we're looking at a situation where the work itself may be meaningful, but the problem is that it is unpaid. Senator Merkley, I'd love for you to tell us whether whether there's a minimum wage requirement and about that, and then backing that up, how your legislation or what you, Professor Goodwin, see as necessary to prevent prisons from just saying, well, it's too expensive to have people work, we're just going to make people sit in a box all day.
So specifically on the constitutional amendment, in striking this punishment clause, there are no details about minimum wage. But if you're striking involuntary servitude, it raises questions that will have to be addressed by the legislature, addressed by the courts about what constitutes involuntary servitude. I do think it's important to note that this is not an argument that jobs in prison are always a bad thing. I have spoken with many prisoners here in Oregon who said the thing that keeps me sane is my daily routine, doing X, Y, and Z. In some cases, the skills I'm developing are the skills that are going to get me a job when I leave this place, and so forth. So it is not a question that a structure inside prison and work inside prison can be valuable in preparing to succeed outside, but it's a question of, is it involuntary? Is it a profit center? Is it failing because you're failing to pay? You are essentially giving a person no foundation for succeeding when they leave prison, and all the associated reverberations of the abuses of the past. And so I think it's a conversation specifically about wages. I feel like prisoners should be paid and should be paid fairly. So you reduce this inside the prison, outside the prison differential, I think, and because if you build up savings, you have an ability when you leave prison to rent an apartment, to get your feet on the ground, to not find yourself in desperate circumstances that often can help drive reincarceration because you commit some crime to try to get by. But that is not the heart of this conversation. The heart of this conversation is that we preserved slavery in the United States, and it had diabolical effects. It continues to be a blight on our nation. And in this conversation about systemic racism, we need to realize this was a key piece of it, and we need to change that.
Let me add to that this has been preservation through transformation. We have preserved slavery, we've just simply transformed it. And in the transformation of it, one of the cruelties of it is that as abolitionists could see the humanity in children, in Black women and Black men who were forced into unpaid labor and servitude, after the 13th Amendment, they simply became criminals and convicts. And it doesn't take much to know that there's a great difference in terms of how a society will relate to you when it sees you as a criminal or a convict or a prisoner. You lose that humanity, the dignity is chipped away at. And I think that that's a significant problem that we have to lingering effect as related to unpaid prison labor. The conviction itself, the serving time behind bars, is the punishment itself. Forcing people into unpaid labor just adds another inhumanity, indignity to actually serving time. And there are ways in which it also harms their communities, to lingering effects as well. Most of the people who are incarcerated in the United States are nonviolent offenders. 2/3 of them happen to be. The majority of these people, especially women, are women who have children. And so when these individuals are forced into unpaid labor, and some of it they may want, because as you say, in prison, this can be a training opportunity. It can be something that relieves boredom. But at the same time, these are people paying enormous fees while in prison that are actually excessive of what they would pay for if they were outside of the carceral system. And then while in the carceral system, they are not being paid for the labor that they are doing. So they're not able to send Christmas presents home. They're not able to actually pay for the fees that they are being charged while they are incarcerated. And there's so many other appendages to how it is that we incarcerate people that further undermine their ability once they leave incarceration to be able to have a meaningful life. Let's be clear. For some of the companies that they work at while they're incarcerated, these are places that would not hire them once they are out because they've not accepted the ban the box. There are people who can't even get jobs as hair braiders after they leave prison because it requires a license, or if you've had a felony, you can't get a license to do that, or to be a barber. And so while this is really important, I think that it's important that our viewers and our listeners understand that the very labor that people do that's unpaid or minimally paid behind bars, they're disenfranchised from actually being able to do much of that work, even while they leave the incarceral state.
Professor Goodwin, I want to drill down on that with you. And then Senator Merkley, I'm going to give you the last word. But just for 1 minute, when you mention these sort of post-prison things, right? Jobs you can't get because you have a record, fees and fines that the court has demanded you pay, but won't let you earn money to pay, even the cost of like, we all forget here on the outside that basic toiletries, deodorant, toothpaste cost wildly more at the prison commissary than they do at the CVS. Phone calls are famously wildly expensive. And this is, of course, counterproductive for people staying in touch with their family and community. So I'd love for you to drill down into what difference you could see if labor was paid. And would that, in a nation that is famous for its wildly high numbers of people living in prison, would that diminish the number of people we actually have in prison?
So First of all, we have a system that is broken from its very beginnings in terms of how it disproportionately surveils, polices, arrests, prosecutes Black people. The data bears that out. We know that the US incarcerates more women than any country in the world, Russia, China, India combined, and toss in Mexico too. So there's a lot of money to be made by the way in which we do all of that. But let's think transformatively about what anybody is able to do when they have a good job. They're able to afford the things that they need for their families. They're able to take care of their children. They're able to pay the lunch fees for their children. They're able to keep their children clothed. They're able to keep their children fed. They're able to help their loved ones with housing and so much more. They're able to create the pathways for a future for themselves once they leave the state of incarceration, because we know the federal government and also state governments have made it very difficult for them once they leave to obtain subsidized housing, to obtain any kind of grants to be able to go on to college, to be able to obtain any kind of loans to be used to be able to go on to college. And so the only way that these individuals will have a fair chance once they get out to create a meaningful life and to avoid recidivism is that their jobs actually pay them what they deserve. And in the case of these California firefighters who are risking their lives every day while battling these fires, it's just absolutely inhumane that they would not be able to earn what it is that they deserve for what they're doing. Because let's be clear, in so many of the communities where they're doing it, they're protecting multi-million-dollar homes.
Wow, that's a stark comparison to think about. And Senator Merkley, I promised you the last word, and specifically, since you are the one bringing a big, bold constitutional amendment plan, I'd love for you to have a minute to speak with our listeners about if an ordinary person on the ground listened to you both today and thought, yeah, this is a really good idea, I'd like to support it. What would that person do?
Well, here's what you would do. You would write to your House and Senate member or send them an email, call them up and say, hey, I've heard about the fact that slavery continued after the Civil War and that it is tied into the mass incarceration today, it's tied into systemic racism, and this is not a good thing. And I really want you to explore this issue. Call up the House and Senate members who are working on this and let me know, are you going to help end this form of evil that is reverberating right onto the current day? That's it's the conversation we need to start among Americans in order to have a movement. And without a movement, you don't get there. So the movement will be essential.
Well, thank you for that. And for our listeners, I hope that was useful. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. Of course, this episode will also be available. If you would rather not see anybody's faces, you could listen to us as a podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to be live again this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern to talk with Maricopa County Board of Supervisors candidate Deidre Aboud. You can follow The Appeal News on Facebook. You can follow The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you all so much for